Talk a little bit about how you have to think about communication with external stakeholders and clients when you want to be a competent professional, but you're also talking about things that are highly variable.
Education of our clients, I think, is key to successful projects, right? I don't pretend to know what a heart surgeon does. I wouldn't,
Right.
attempt to advise him on what he should or she should or shouldn't be doing. I trust that they're a professional. If they're going to be open up my body, that they know what they're doing. So, they trust us as a partner, right? They trust us to. In our
There is nothing more important for leaders in the AEC industry than being able to communicate effectively, both with people external to your organization and internal. In today's episode, I'm talking with John Walton, licensed professional engineer, principal at Colliers Engineering and Design. And as a geotechnical engineer working with highly variable subsurface conditions, John really understands firsthand how critical communication is to technical success. So we're going to talk about how he communicates with clients and recommends that his team members does in widely variable situations that can be frustrating to all of the parties involved. He's also going to talk about something that I think all leaders need to create on their teams as AEC professionals that most people don't talk about, but it's fundamental to effective communication. Lots of awesome stuff in this episode. Now, before we jump in, I do want to tell you about AEC PM Connect, an interactive experience where civil engineers can sharpen their project management and leadership skills through real-world sessions on AI and project management, earned value, scope creep, risk management, and other important topics. The event will take place on June 10th, 2026 at the Forest Gate Country Club in New Jersey, and you can register at aecpmconnect.com. I'm your host, Anthony Fasano, and this is the Civil Engineering Podcast, the industry's leading show for civil engineering professionals, ranked as the #1 civil engineering podcast by FeedSpot. John, welcome to the Civil Engineering Podcast.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Excited to have you. So maybe you could start off by telling our audience a little bit about the work that you do at Colliers.
Sure. So my position is I am the national discipline leader for geotechnical services. I've been with Colliers Engineering and Design for 14 years as of this January, and I'm have about 30 years in the industry. So my day to day is managing the different teams that we have throughout the country. We are predominantly as a company, we're over 90 offices nationally. As far as my group, we're sitting in about six offices, six states, from New York down to Florida and then over to Texas. So my day to day is managing all of those operations, my regional discipline leaders and their teams, focusing on growing our discipline within the company. Obviously, CED is a multidiscipline company, so we have a lot of opportunity internally to help support our other service lines as well as our own individual work that we do. So, people management, financial management, strategy. Almost feel guilty calling myself an engineer anymore, but I still get involved in projects here and there at an advisory level, which is at the core of most engineers why we get into this business.
Yeah, that's great. And I think geotechnical is such an interesting discipline of civil engineering, and we're going to get into this a bit, but it's so variable. There's so many different things you can deal with on a day-to-day basis, which means it creates a lot of interesting communications and conversations and things that you have to go through both internally as well as
Sure.
externally. And so one of the things I really want to talk to you about today, John, is communication. I mean, communication is really the essence of everything we do in engineering and leadership, basically. And I want to talk about communications both internally and externally, right? Of course, when you work for a multidisciplinary firm like you do, you have a lot of internal communications, not just with your team, but with others. And of course, you have a lot of clients and other stakeholders externally. So let's start externally here because as a geotechnical engineer, you often have to communicate with clients and the work you do, like we said, is highly variable. So you don't necessarily always have all the answers. You can't see all the answers, right? Until you kind of get to them subsurface. And so talk a little bit about how you have to think about communication with external stakeholders and clients when you want to be a competent professional, but you're also talking about things that are highly variable.
Yeah, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head, Anthony. And for those that may not, really understand what geotech is in a nutshell, geotechnical engineering is the application of soil and rock mechanics to solving engineering problems. Right. That's if you had to, classify a geotechnical engineer, that's what it would be in a nutshell.
You're
So part
telling
of
us what's going on
yeah.
underground that we can't see, right? Essentially.
In layman's terms, that's exactly it. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. So, I'm sure any of you that have, walked into your backyard or walked through a park or anything, you see variability in the terrain, soil, you might see rocks sticking up out of the ground. So, yeah, variability is the spice of life in in geotechnical engineering specifically. So, our primary service that we provide to our clients is that as they're looking at a piece of property, we'll go out and we will explore the property, right? We'll drill borings, dig test pits, basically just poking at the site, collecting samples of the soil and rock, testing it in our laboratories, assessing what impact that's going to have to the project overall. Meaning, can they design for conventional spread footings? Are there poor soils? Do they have to design deep foundations to support the building? Soil modification. Are there groundwater measures that they have to consider for implementation during the project? So that might seem any of those on an individual basis might seem trivial, but in the concept of an overall land development project can be quite have a substantial impact, not only in the cost of the project, but in the construction schedule and the types of contractors, maybe even specialty contractors that you might need for the project.
And
Um,
and John, couldn't it
yeah.
also even dictate whether or not they do the project?
Absolutely, yeah. We look at a lot of properties that, that end up, never moving forward to construction because quite frankly, geotechnical is one of those areas that could be a deal breaker for a project, right? If a client, owner, developer, if they have a pro forma, they have a cost in mind or they have a cost window that they're able to work with, maybe they find out that the site has a lot of challenges associated with it, which is gonna it's not gonna make it feasible for their particular development scheme within their budget. So,
Yeah.
it's a very good point. But so
And
going back to your
I
yeah, so
mentioned that,
go ahead.
John. Just want to say I mentioned that because I think of an analogy as like you fall in love with a house you're going to buy, right?
Sure,
And
yeah.
you have a home inspector that's doing an inspection, and you're sitting there and you're thinking to yourself, this home inspector better come back with good news so I can purchase the property. The same thing with a site. I found this beautiful site I want to develop or redevelop or whatever the case may be. And I've got this geotechnical engineer doing a report and they better come back with good news type of thing. I'm just saying that like just thinking about what we're talking about communication, that's kind of bit of a pressure filled situation because you're kind of they want good news, but you can only give them what you find.
Exactly. Yeah, 100%. It's a great analogy actually. And again, that's just part of what we do. We do as projects do the projects that do move forward. We have an opportunity to do, a lot of design work, whether it's designing the foundations for a building or maybe for piers for a bridge. We get to design retaining walls, supportive excavation during construction. So we get to some pretty substantial heavy design throughout projects, depending on the project. And then, of course, in addition to all that, we provide services on the back end during construction, which we refer to as CMT, construction materials testing. Basically, what we're providing is QA/QC to the owner, right? Testing the materials that the contractor is using on site to make sure that they fall within what the specifications for the project are, right? So, say, for example, the project calls for 4,000 psi concrete. So we'll go out, when they're placing concrete, we'll collect samples, we'll bring them back to our lab, and we'll test them for their strength, right? So if it's 4,000 psi concrete and it tests at or over 4,000, they're good. If it never reaches that 4,000 psi, that's when we have to put our clients and the contractor on notice that there might be something wrong with that mix. So that's just one
Interesting.
example of,
Yeah.
the services that we provide during construction. So, and again, it goes back to the theme of variability, right? I mean, even with quote unquote known construction materials that are have to, that usually have assigned typical properties, there's still variability, right? Depending on how, materials are processed, how they're handled on site, Some of it has to do with workmanship, with concrete. Some of it has to do with how long the concrete's sitting in the truck before they place it. There's actually restrictions on that, on how long the concrete can sit in a truck. So, when you look at a project life cycle and the involvement of geotechnical engineering, we truly are involved from the beginning to the end, right? Um, and along that entire project life cycle are the variables, right? So going back to your original topic of communication, education of our clients, I think, is key to successful projects, right? I don't pretend to know what a heart surgeon does. I wouldn't,
Right.
attempt to advise him on what he should or she should or shouldn't be doing. I trust that they're a professional, if they're going to be open up my body, that they know what they're doing. So, which is where a lot of our clients are. They trust us as a partner, right? They trust us to and our expertise to be able to help them have a successful project. But in order for that to happen, particularly in the concept of variability as things change throughout a project, maintaining that communication with the client, letting them know, maybe giving them a heads up early on. We identify something during the exploration phase that could have an impact on the project. It might even have an impact on our exploration program, meaning we encounter something that was unanticipated, we may want to explore that a little bit more. So that communication with the client or with the owner in real time allows us to make those decisions and pivot and adjust as needed. So, but the education part of that is, if a client hires us to perform a certain scope, and then all of a sudden you know, the things that are encountered dictate a change in scope, the owner's going to want to understand why, right? I mean, if you hire a contractor to build an addition on your house, right, and they give you an estimate of $100,000 or something like that, and then they come back to you after it's all done and say, "Well, yeah, it actually costs 150." You probably wouldn't be too happy about that, right? So,
Right.
but if that contractor was communicating with you ahead of time and saying, "Here, for reasons X, Y, and Z, we're seeing this coming to get to the same end result. Let's talk about it," right? Um, so in the engineering industry and the land development industry, for a lot of owners, it's really managing risk, right? And cost versus risk. So, some clients, and depending on the type of project, what they're actually looking to build, certain levels of risk might be more tolerable. Certain clients, certain levels of risk just are not palatable for them. And sometimes it's dictated by their past development history, right? Something went wrong that they don't want to happen again. So, they're a little gun shy, so to speak. But the overarching point is that the more communication you have with your client throughout the process, early and often and throughout the process, and taking the time to educate them on the why, right?
Yes.
Not just saying, "Hey, this is changing, this is what we need to do." It's saying, "This is what we're seeing. These are the reasons why are providing you with these options. These are the levels of risk roughly associated with each option. What do you feel comfortable doing?" Right? The
Mm.
owner should be an integral part of that decision-making process and what we do as engineers.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. Getting buy-in from the owner up front, keeping them in the loop the entire time, educating them where you need to. And I think the analogy you used about the surgeon is a good one because, yeah, I don't know about heart surgery, but if I'm getting heart surgery, I certainly want the doctor to maybe brief me on what they're going to do, the background, why it's needed. And I also probably, the doctor will probably say something to me like, listen, I'm telling you this, but when we get in there, we're not necessarily sure what we're going to find, right? Which is also very similar to what you're dealing with in terms of variables. So, I think it's a really important point for those of you out there, in any walk of civil engineering. I mean, I experienced this doing site development myself as well, is that applying communication from the beginning, from the kickoff of the project all the way through is very important, keeping them updated. If you do find something that wasn't what was anticipated, let them know, whether it's a subsoil that doesn't look good or in my case, sometimes it would have been something that the planning board asked us to do that wasn't in the original scope that we had to go back and explain to our client, right? So, but I think to John's point, if the communication is constant and consistent, it becomes easier with that client. You develop a relationship with that client I think the last thing you want to do, which I see some technical professionals do, is call the client only when something bad happens. And that's not the trap that we want to fall into, because then they're like, oh gosh, John's calling me again. Something must be wrong. Right. And
Right.
that's not where we want to be with our clients. That's
Right.
for sure.
And I guess to reinforce a point that I didn't really touch on though about communication is that we were talking a lot about communicating with client and educating them, but it's a two-way street, right? So in order for an engineer to be able to service our client, we want to understand where they're at, right? We want to understand what their goals. We want that to be clearly defined so that you know we can take all the tools in our toolbox and use them, leverage them to their advantage, so that the client's going to have the most successful project that they can have. That's the end goal. So the communication is definitely a two-way street throughout the project.
Yeah, that's great. And that's a really important point. I think that you mentioned the two-way street of it. I think a lot of times when we think of communication, we think of talking or speaking or sending people information, but it is a two-way street. And hopefully half the time, at least, you're the one doing the listening and taking in information. And especially in a
Yes.
world where you're dealing with a client, when you want to serve them, right, and provide them value, to John's point, you can't really provide them value unless you know what they want, right? You know what their goals are.
Right.
And that's really important. And for those of you, by the way, that work in the public sector, we may use the word client, but you can also substitute that with stakeholders on your projects, right? Maybe you're working with a
Absolutely.
municipality, you're working with a politician that you're dealing with that's driving a project. The same thing applies in that situation. So, all right. So as far as clients go, we're talking about, constant communication early on and throughout the project, keeping them up to date, educating them where they need to be educated if it's something that they're not aware of or they're not familiar with.
Mhm.
Very important. So let's switch gears now, and I want to talk about internal team communication. I know you,
Mhm.
lead people, which is something that for technical professionals, it takes us time to start getting into leadership and developing some of our leadership skills. And
Right.
communication is just fundamental in leadership. So let's start off. I'd love to hear a little bit about your overarching kind of philosophy as a leader when it comes to communication.
Absolutely. I can tell you that if you were to speak with anybody on my team, right now they would tell you that they're probably sick of me, saying that communication is 90% of our problems. It truly is. But, at the same time, negativity can play a big role in, you know, day-to-day life, day-to-day operations, challenges with projects and things like that. So for me as a manager, and I've been fortunate to have very diverse experience throughout my career, both with project types and different managers that I've worked with. And, I like to think that I try to take the best of each of those experiences and kind of meld them in together into, the leader that I am today. An important thing that I have learned for myself as a leader is that I don't care what level you are in your career, you never stop learning. There is always, as much as you think you might know or how smart you think you are, there's always something you don't know, or there's always something that you can work on doing a little bit better. So part of my philosophy is, you know, it is being humble. It's being confident, but being humble. Recognizing that we all can always improve in what we're doing. Our CEO, Kevin Haney, Anthony, you may have even heard him say it in the past, do 2% better, right?
Yeah,
Whether it's every day, every
incremental.
week, every year, the point is you're making progress in the right direction, right? So, and as far as being a people manager, it really is about the people, right? It's not necessarily about how they're handling their projects, whether they're doing the right thing or the wrong thing. It's about them, as humans, right? So, and what I mean by that is that there is a culture. As a leader, there's a culture. Your company can have a culture, but your team can have its own subset culture within the company, right? For various reasons, and a lot of it can just simply be based around the commonality that you all have an expertise in this specific discipline, right? So we all relate to each other on a level that we don't necessarily relate to our colleagues in another service line, like survey or environmental, something like that. So, and we can all learn from each other in that regard too. So we were talking about education before, right? Communication and education with external clients, and it being a two-way street. For me, I feel very much the same about my team, even my colleagues, my peers, right? The more we communicate and the better we communicate, because any of us that have been around for a while know that, communication is more than just words coming out of our mouth or words that we're putting into an email. It's delivery, it's presence, it's tone, inflection, and it's the method of communication that you're using, right? Depending on the topic and depending on the urgency, is an email okay? Or does
Right.
something warrant a phone call because you need to address something, swiftly, right? And so for being a people manager, the people really do come first. And for me, I've seen some dynamics with the group that I'm in, and you know, we have really this past year in particular, we've really been focusing on positivity and improving morale of the group. Not that it was bad per se before, but in in my experience with leading teams is that the more cohesive they are and the more positivity there is, the better outlook there is, and the more motivated they are to not only do well for themselves but do well for the team, right? Because we are truly working as a team. And hopefully my team would tell you that my door is open to anybody. It's not just my direct reports, my top managers. I want all of my staff to know that they can come to me at any time to talk about anything, right?
That's great.
And there's a level of trust that has to be built there for the staff to feel comfortable doing that. It's one thing for me to sit here and say it, but I have to lead by example, right? I have to put myself in a position that allows staff to feel comfortable. And sometimes that means that I have to be vulnerable with my own experiences or, lessons learned that I've been through in my career, because I've been through a bunch. And most of us that have been around, not everything goes perfect. So even within staff, I'll share an anecdotal story, which is that, uh, I'm the youngest of five. I came from a fairly big family. We were all, my experience growing up was that we were all raised pretty much the same way. Didn't matter, boy, girl, age, didn't matter.
Right.
So once I had kids, I have two boys, and when they were younger, I kind of used the parenting style that I was exposed to, which is you treat them the same. And it didn't take long for me to realize that my sons were two very different people, right? And, I learned ways to communicate with them, based on the type of person that they were. And I actually took that experience and moved it into my management style, because my management style was very similar. I set a bar, I had an expectation for every employee. It didn't matter what you did or who you were or how long you've been doing this. But at the end of the day, we're all humans, right? We all take different approaches to things, and meeting people at their level goes a long way towards helping build that trust, in my opinion and in my experience. So that's a big part of my internal communication with my own team. And on the positivity front, it's, there's always going to be headwinds. There's always going to be challenges that we're going to face. But in every example of adversity, you can find some positivity. However small it might be, you can find it. If you really want to find it, you can find it. And if
Hmm.
you focus on the positive things and not dwell on the negative things, inherently it helps build morale. And it's been pretty successful.
That's great. And yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. You gave us a couple golden nuggets that I want to just hit on. One of them, the last one, I think is really important, is that there really isn't like a cookie cutter style you can use with every person on your team, because everybody is truly different. And I think that's one of the interesting things about being a leader is
You,
you can't just, "Hey, Chat GPT, tell me what to say to this person." It doesn't work
yeah,
that way because everyone's
yeah,
different, and we talk about communication work styles a lot in kind of the PM training and leadership development work that we do, because everyone does have slightly different communication styles, right? Someone's a little bit more analytical, someone's a little bit more expressive or big picture, and definitely speaking to that is important. And I think the one thing that you said that I really wanted to touch on was the team culture piece. I think that's really important because I think what happens in the world today is, companies have culture and we think of it at the company level, but in all reality, what you're dealing with on a day to day basis is your team. right? That's who you show up with every day. That's who you deal with. And you do need to have your own team culture. And I recently heard culture defined as how people feel about working where they work, which I think is a great way to think about it, right? Because I think as a leader, it speaks to what you talked about building that trust with your team, having that open door, but they have to trust in you to be able to embrace that. Is that's part of your culture, right? Like, you have to set the culture so people really enjoy coming to work and working with you and their team members every day, because if they don't, like, it doesn't end well. I mean, that's why people leave companies, right? Because they don't like their managers, they don't like the team environment that they're on, and that really maybe doesn't have anything to do with the company culture. I mean, it might, like, the company culture could inform your team culture, and maybe it's like kind of a drip down effect, but
Right.
at the end of the day, as a leader, you're creating this atmosphere for your team, whether it's virtual or in person or whatever it is. And
Mhm.
that really is going to dictate how they show up every day, their experience there, and their ultimately their relationships with each other and with you.
Mhm. Absolutely, and it's a good point, and another way that I look at things is no matter what your level is or what your role and a responsibility is, you can be an agent of change, right? You have, if you want to, right? So, in tune with what you just said, right? You can have the culture of a company and then the subculture of a particular group. So, but if you see something where there's area for improvement, if you don't say anything, if you just, whisper under your breath or say to yourself, man, this sucks, or I wish that could be better. Speak up, you
Right.
know, talk to somebody. What's the worst they're going to say? No, right?
Right. But that's also culture, right? They have to be comfortable enough to speak up in the situation. And if they're not, that's how I think teams get on the bad track, because if someone has all these amazing ideas, this great professional, but they're just not
Mhm.
willing to share them.
Right, exactly. And I think if we're all as leaders, I think we need to be open-minded to the fact that as much experience and expertise that we can bring to the table for our staff, there's a lot that we can learn from our staff, the people that we work with. Again, it's the it's the you never stop learning, right? And you can learn, you don't always have to learn from somebody that's older than you or wiser than you. Doesn't matter, people can have great ideas, important input, and I think it's important that as leaders we're open-minded to that and give people the opportunity to express, opinions and ideas, and again, communicate, talk about it, and if it's something that makes sense, then let's go after it. Let's tackle it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So a lot of good stuff there in communication. Let me just hit a couple of the main points we touched on. Then we're going to put John on our civil engineering hot seat to kind of wrap us up for today. So we talked about external and client communication, and John talked about sometimes we really need to educate, external parties because they're not aware of the type of work we do or the impacts related to it. And a big
Mhm.
piece of effective communication externally is constant communication from the beginning of the project all the way through to the end, keeping people updated, so that it is easier to address situations that arise, things that come up, adversity that
Mhm.
happens, because they're comfortable with you. You've built a relationship, and there is a very good back and forth relationship with the external parties, right? So those are some tips on that. And then internal communication with your team members. John talked a lot about as a leader how having that open communication, right? Let's talk to each other. Let's always. I think the continuous improvement, John, that you focus on is really important, because that's also a bit of a mindset and a culture that you can promote within your team. Is like, hey, something happened here. It wasn't great, but there's something we can take out of it. We can build on it. We can become better if the leader of that team has set the culture that way. That's important. And I think, I guess the big piece of that is that word culture. John talked about how you can build your team culture, and the team culture can kind of be built around a lot of the stuff that we talked about, John, the open door policy, building trust with each other, right? If you have an idea, speak up, I want to hear it type of thing, and you promoting
Yeah.
people and getting them to open up.
Yep. Exactly. That's it.
That's it. So those are some really good communication tips. Now what we're going to do is we're going to pause for a minute. We'll come back and we'll wrap up the episode by putting John on our civil engineering career hot seat. We'll be right back. In the AEC industry, skilled project managers are the backbone of success. EMI's AEC PM certification offers tailored training, ongoing support, and exclusive access to premium content that keeps your team sharp and effective.
From foundational training to advanced leadership tools, set your team apart with certified growth. Learn more at aecpm.com. That's aecpm.com.
All right, so welcome back. Once again, we're here with John Walton, licensed professional engineer, principal at Colliers Engineering and Design. John gave us some great tips on communication, both externally and internally in your organizations. And now we're going to wrap up by putting John on our civil engineering career hot seat. You ready, John?
Ready as I'll be.
All right. All right. So, first question. Do you have any specific rituals or maybe routines that you practice every day, whether it's a morning routine or a lunchtime routine, or just anything that you do regularly that has helped you to be successful as a professional?
Well, not that 99% of the rest of the world doesn't start their day with a coffee, but that's how I start mine. Ritual I can't say. The only thing I can honestly really think of is that, financial management has always been my understanding of that, and a lot of it I've learned and been self-taught, throughout my career. And I get a lot of satisfaction out of having a financially successful operation. So ritual, if you call it, this is where I guess I'll dive into my nerdy manager role, is that I'm constantly in our accounting system, right? I'm looking at what all of our teams are doing, looking for red flags with our projects, and again, communicating, right? Throughout a month, I'm communicating with my managers, with my team members based on what I'm seeing in our accounting system, so that we're prepared, on a monthly basis to close out that month as strong as we can. So I would say as far as a ritual goes, I ritually kind of live in our accounting system.
That's great. I think that's a good practice to build for leaders in this industry. All right. So, John, if you think back of your managers in the past, and you don't have to name names, but if you think of your favorite or couple of favorite managers, what was it that made them your favorite? We're trying to think about, what are some of the traits of really good leaders in the AEC industry?
So it's a great question, and I've had several managers throughout my career. Some I've enjoyed working with more than others, certainly to your point. And like I mentioned before, I've tried to make a concerted effort to kind of cherry pick, what are the things I enjoyed about working with that manager that I can incorporate into my management style. What's something that I didn't like about this particular manager? And I want to make sure that I'm concertedly making an effort to not do that as a manager with my staff, right? So, I think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about with my leadership style, is that I tended to gravitate towards the leaders that were open-minded, right? They wanted to have very casual conversations. They were actively engaged. They were actively listening with you when you communicated, as opposed to them just always, looking to push their agenda, because I've had managers like that as well. So I would say by and large, the leadership that I have identified most with are those that I've had great conversations with, and it's been, respectful two-way communication, regardless of the fact that we're on different planes within the hierarchy.
That's great. And obviously, from John's comments earlier, you can see that he's really adopted that in the way that he leads his team and interacts with his team. And honestly, that's a great blueprint for anyone out there who wants to be a manager or leader in the AEC industry is pay attention to your managers as you kind of grow up in the industry. Take the good stuff, discard the bad stuff, and you can create a really good, framework and philosophy for yourself as a leader as you go through your career. All right, John, I got one final question for you. We call it the civil engineering career elevator advice question. You get into an elevator with an up and coming civil engineering professional. You've got about 30 to 40 seconds with that person to give some career advice. What would you share with that person?
What I would share is, a piece of advice would be, you can't follow your passion until you identify what your passion is. And don't put too much pressure on yourself to identify what that passion is very early in your career. Don't be afraid to explore new opportunities. Even if you're already headed down a particular path, opportunities are going to present themselves throughout your career, you're going to find. And, you know, you're the master of your own destiny, right? Your choices dictate your career path. So, um, if you identify something that you really enjoy doing, if the opportunity doesn't it present itself to you, maybe you go and follow that opportunity, right? You find that opportunity and you chase it. So in the engineering realm, if you enjoy problem solving, and if you like helping other people, engineering could be a career to consider, because that's exactly what we do. We're technical people that solve problems, but ultimately we're helping our clients have a successful project.
I think that's a great answer. I just had a conversation with my son who's a junior in high school, and I said something similar to him in that you're looking at colleges. There's no way anyone can expect you to know what you want to do with your life at 16, 17,
No,
18 years old, right?
absolutely.
But to
Mm.
the same point that John makes in your engineering career is try things, meet people, try different experiences, and every time you have an experience you like, you're gonna say, "Hey, I kinda like this. Maybe I should move a little bit more in this direction," right? And you kind of are the author of your book, if you will, as John said, and you can kinda, drive your career. So, John Walton, Colliers Engineering and Design, really appreciate you spending some time with us on the Civil Engineering Podcast today. Thank you so much for this, John.
Anthony, thank you. It's been great chatting with you, and look forward to talking to you again soon, man.
Thanks, John.
All right, take care. We'll see you.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with John. He was awesome today. Great tips on communication, externally and internally. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe to our channel here. We put out videos like this on a weekly basis to help AEC professionals become better project managers and leaders. I'll see you next week.